of me, and we'll try to answer them. Again, any and all questions are completely welcome. Nothing's off base. So let's get kicking with this last class. We talked, I think, about how the government came to be. We talked about how they started dealing with the initial issues and how difficult the situation was right from the outset. But by middle of 1863, clearly, things like the Confederacy had endured the Gettysburg, Vicksburg week of complete gloom that hung over the Confederacy. Even Mary Chesnut wrote in her famous diary that she saw that as the end. Stonewall Jackson was already in his grave in Virginia. New Orleans had long since fallen. The biggest city in the Confederacy was blocked out. Inflation was completely out of control. People couldn't afford much of anything. Desertion was becoming more and more impactful on General Lee and certainly on the Western armies, the Army of Tennessee. And resistance at every level was growing to the government and to the service, the armies. The resistance from the people who were very reluctant to either join the army or to remain in the army. But the resistance from the state legislatures, the state governments was intense. And then the resistance from the members of the Confederate federal government, the House, the Senate, and the Cabinet, to the administration. Some people, I guess, were just separating themselves from the losses and the difficulties. Others were genuinely concerned about what the Davis administration was doing, the way it was dealing with the problems as they came up, more and more complex, more and more overwhelming. And so the gathering storm clouds were progressively more gloomy as 1863 moved on into 1864. I think I pointed out the other day that the governing was already, governing the Confederate States are already under Union control by the middle of 1863 and the beginning of 1864. That was becoming a larger and larger mass of land where the Confederacy really had no control over its own territory. That would include virtually all of Tennessee, large chunks of Mississippi, most all of Missouri, and the North Carolina coast, parts of the South Carolina coast as well, the Gulf Coast areas, and of course Texas and Arkansas being part of the Cross Mississippi, Cis Mississippi organization under Edmund Kirby Smith. They were virtually out of communication with General Smith, who was the highest ranking Confederate general over on the other side of the Mississippi, virtually having complete control of supplying his army, directing his soldiers, directing the whole Confederacy. There's a book called Kirby Smith's Confederacy, and it was out of necessity because there was virtually no communication. And of course, that meant that no more Texans could come across and serve in the Army of Northern Virginia. There was just basic, like a complete separation after the fall of Vicksburg. And frankly, even before the fall of Vicksburg. The fall of Vicksburg just made it all much more official. And so the Congress and the Davis administration locked horns because the Congress was under great pressure to do more to help the people. What they could have done, I don't know, but they just felt like they it was their role to be critical because the people were critical. They needed to represent the people from their standpoint. And so the relations between them, between the cabinet and the both houses, became problematic. As a matter of fact, I think I suggested the other day that a lot of the congressmen and senators were U.S. congressmen and senators prior to the war. And as a result, that their whole orientation was to be anti-government from the time that they were representing the minority, the southern minority in both houses of the U.S. Congress. So essentially, they took that same position in the Confederate House, both houses of the Confederate Congress. And they became oppositional to Davis and his administration. Especially some of the more well-known and experienced and more outspoken leadership types in federal government. Among them, especially Louis Wigfall of Texas, Robert Toombs of Georgia, Henry Foote of Tennessee, R.M.T. Hunter of Virginia, and of course, Robert Barnwell Rhett of South Carolina, who was the editor of Charleston Mercury, the most influential newspaper in the Confederacy and in the South before the Civil War. These guys just took constant shots at Davis and did everything they possibly could to basically undermine his leadership. And at one point, in late 1864, Toombs called for the Confederate government to end as such and to just establish General Lee as the dictator and put him in charge and have him in complete control of the Confederate government. I don't know how real that was, probably didn't go very far, but the point is that these things were said, and there's a record of it in the Confederate. Yes.
Did they use the term dictator, or did it just mean new president?
I'm not sure precisely, but I think that he did use that word. It is a totally powerful word. I hesitated to even say it, but I think he did because there's very little that Robert Toombs would say, because he had one thing about him, and I was reading William C. Davis, and so it comes from, you'll find it in William C. Davis's writings. He had trouble with alcohol. Toombs did. And when he drank, as a matter of fact, he early on in the administration, he was one of Georgia's major secessionists. And therefore, he was one of the primary candidates being considered for the president of the Confederacy. And Davis indicated that he was because he was a strong secessionist, real leader, that at one point he was the favorite to be appointed the first president. The problem was that when they were in Montgomery together meeting, he was under the influence of alcohol and shut his mouth off enough to where it discouraged people from making him the nominee for president. So he was appointed into the cabinet, but then quit soon thereafter, and went and stopped being a supporter and just became a critic. As time went on, he became vociferous, and he was a real thorn in the side of the government. I'm sure that any discouragement of the government was a discouragement of the army and discouragement of the establishment, and brought doubt to into the halls of governance because of his you know, pre-war influence as a planter, as a leader of the state of Georgia. And to combine with Alexander Stevens, who was also a Georgian, also, a pre-war leader, although Stevens was not a secessionist, he was a cooperationist, that's for sure. But together, they combined after things started going bad, and from Georgia, they teamed up with Governor Brown, and were really extreme in the way that they dealt with the Davis administration. So that environment was what the Confederate government was dealing with after the middle of 1863 and into 1864. The Battle above the Clouds in November 1863 pushed the Confederate Army of Tennessee out of Tennessee and into Georgia. And that's where they held their winter quarters until the spring campaign started in 1864. Grant gave Sherman control over the Western armies, and he confronted Lee, and the whole idea was to keep the Union armies constantly attacking so that the Confederate armies couldn't transfer men as needed as they had done in the past. But that put Georgia in the crosshairs because Sherman, Atlanta was Atlanta, and it was a major strong point, transportation hub of the South that kept things together. Remember, when Tennessee was lost, all those rail lines between Memphis and Nashville and Chattanooga, they were all virtually lost to the Confederacy right from 1862. And so the issue of logistics became extremely difficult. And now, the state of Georgia was being directly threatened by the Western, Union armies. And this is where the issue of the criticism by Brown and Stevens and Toombs really came home to hurt the Confederate Army of Tennessee, which at the time was still led by Braxton Bragg. And in looking at Mr. Davis's book, just the other day, I found a quote that from Joe Brown's Army, it was written by William Harris Bragg. It said General Braxton's conscription officer, General Gideon Pillow, claimed that in mid-1863 that Georgia was full of able-bodied men who had slipped through the hands of the government and of refugees. In other words, they were being covered by the governor, and they weren't being forced into being conscripted. They were allowed to. The government, the state, was looking the other way. And they were strongly discouraging Confederate conscription officers. They were frustrating them to keep Georgians out of the army and able to stay home. At the end of 1863, there were 13,000 men aged 18 to 45 in the militia rolls, out of a total of 41,000 enrolled. So 41,000 were enrolled, 13,000 were actually under arms. That was the state of the situation in Georgia. And when you have enough trouble, if you have a government trying to recruit men, and the state is just, doing everything they can to help these men not serve in the Confederate Army, and only serve, for example, in Georgia, which was Joe Brown's idea. You could see how that had not only a negative effect in the state, but beyond that, with North Carolinians, and their Governor Vance was almost as big a problem as Governor Brown. So that was a big problem. Yes.
This is probably a stupid question, but
No, so sorry.
they weren't getting paid anything, right?
Yes, they were.
They were getting paid?
They were getting paid $11 a month. That was the private, if you were general, you got more. A private,
And food and uniform.
right. Right. So $11 wasn't going to do anything.
Confederate dollars.
It got, yes, they were not paid.
Nice.
Or take paper money.
Yeah, it should collapse, they could collapse to their shit. But the point is, that was the disastrous portion. It's just yet another,
But that was their philosophy, right? Each state was basically their own country.
well,
And
Yeah.
that was what was important. That was what was important to Lee, to these people and other states.
now here's an interesting take on that. You're right. For the people like Joe Brown and the governors of Alabama, yeah, they could afford to do that. If you were the governor of Virginia and the war was going on in your own state, how could you afford to do that? You couldn't. You had to keep calling your men in and trying to keep them there. Because Lee's biggest problem, if you read his wartime papers, which is a really awesome thing, you'll see how he frets constantly with the President, Jefferson Davis, and the Secretary of War, James Sedgwick, about how the extreme movement he has to do to keep soldiers from deserting day after day after day. Middle of 1864, I mean, it was a huge problem, and it was part and parcel of all this gloom that you have to naturally feel it. After Gettysburg, that's why I think Gettysburg was a huge event during the war. Till that point, the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia just felt, just unbeatable. But after Gettysburg, they couldn't feel that way anymore. Just the opposite happened with the Army of the Potomac. They just felt like they couldn't get out of their own way with miserable generalship and lackluster, secondary, commanders. After Gettysburg, boy, they just felt like, okay, it's going to be tough, but we can do this. And at the end, after the election of 1864, there was a competition between the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Tennessee and the Cumberlands and the Western armies to be able to finish the war off themselves. That's why in 1864, so many, a huge percentage of those men re-enlisted voluntarily. There, a large number of them, this was a potential problem for Sherman and Grant and Lincoln as well, meant very large percentage of their troops. Their 3-year commitments were expiring in late 1864, but they could sense the victory, and they were involved. They were believers. Many of them were certainly not abolitionists, still not abolitionists by any stretch of the imagination. They felt superior to blacks in every way, shape, and form. But they saw that blacks were serving with them alongside of them, fighting and bleeding and being shot along with them. And they felt commitment, that they felt that essentially the same commitment that they felt prior to the war, that they didn't want to compete against, slaveholders for the opportunity to make a living west of wherever they lived in this country. And they saw how blacks were suffering along with them, and they said, okay, let's just finish this off. And there was a rivalry between those two armies. And I forgot where I read this, but it's been a couple of places where when Sherman, after he took Savannah and Charleston, started moving back up north, he was being opposed by Joe Johnston's remnants of the Army of Tennessee. And he kept moving north, and that gave the Army of the Potomac an awful lot of pressure to finish Lee off themselves without the help of Sherman. And there was a lot of competition that way. They did not want, they, you read about the intensity of battles on the way to Appomattox, some of the battles that they had. And the Union armies were very intense, and they were throwing caution to the wind in their frontal assaults against the Confederates. They were doing it because they wanted to end the war. They didn't want the help of the Army of the West to defeat R.E. Lee. And that glimmer, that first spark of confidence came, I believe, at Gettysburg, when their backs were to the wall. This is something as an aside, really, one of the strategic errors I think he made. When they were fighting in Virginia, where Lee used the territory and always had the inside, edge as far as intelligence is concerned, the Army of the Potomac always had someplace to retreat to. In Pennsylvania, they were there. They couldn't retreat from Pennsylvania much anymore, especially the Pennsylvania troops and the New York troops. They were in the north, and there was just no place to retreat. They had to stay there, and they bore the brunt of those Longstreet attacks on day 2, and they stayed the course. And I think that made a big difference. I don't think they ever could forget that. And that gave them, I believe, the confidence to go and finish the job in late 1864 and 1865, despite all those terrible losses that they incurred during the Grant's Overland Campaign, from the Rappahannock River, past horrendous battlefields of Spotsylvania and Cold Harbor, to where they could finally, trap Lee at Gettysburg and Petersburg.
Yes, defensively, wasn't that his plan or his thought to scare Washington D.C. so much by surrounding it that he would get a quick victory, a quick collapse of the will of the North?
That's true. That was his thought at Antietam.
It didn't work, but that was his thought, right?
Yes, right. But logistically, to know, by the time of mid-1863, Washington area had become the most highly fortified city in the world. All those forts that you see that you drive up and down the Potomac on the Virginia side, those forts were all there, to protect Washington. Fort Stevens, the presence of Fort Stevens made a huge difference to stop Jubal Early in July of 1864, when Lee sent Early up the valley to threaten Washington, to try and alleviate the pressure on himself. Fort Stevens was there, and even though there was a small amount of troops to defend Washington, that fortress helped stop it, along with the Battle of Monocacy. But Grant was able to use the waterways and all those naval ships to get his corps, his 5th Corps, right up to Washington, march right up 17th Street or 16th Street, right up to the fort, and repel Early's attack. But it was, they tried everything. I recognize that Lee was as great a tactician as any general. And he had great confidence in his men. They had great confidence in him. And I think armies like that could do a lot. I think that had a lot to do with why the war lasted as long as it did. On the other hand, I think that if he was trying to do the George Washington theory of not just staying in business until your opponent gave up, that was not the thing to do. Because had he done that and stayed in Virginia and not lost so dramatically, and given his opponents the confidence that it did, the war might well have lasted a lot longer than it did in the Virginia theater. I think that's a fair thought, a fair thesis. But nonetheless, this is what was going on, and as far as Georgia was concerned, that was a microcosm of the big picture problem that the Confederates had. They were collapsing basically from within, and politically, the leadership was hypercritical and destructive of its own goals. There was some, in reading that Davis book, I found a quote from Alexander Stevens. He said, as far as conscription in 1862, conscription, he was against the Conscription Act. He said, he wrote it, better in my judgment that Richmond should fall and the enemy's armies should sweep our whole country from the Potomac to the Gulf, then our people should submissively yield obedience to one of these edicts of our generals. So basically, he was saying that we're just, we're volunteers, and if people want to, conscript us, I'd rather see the Confederacy fall. Well, early 1865, the Confederacy was falling, and he wasn't alone in that feeling. There were many other, not only people, average people, but leaders who felt the way. Toombs was another one. And so, how can you, if you're Jefferson Davis, how do you lead a country where you have so many outspoken people who are leaders in the new Confederate government, who were so staunchly opposed to having to create laws and rules and regulations to keep the country afloat, to keep the country strong enough to maintain itself in the battlefield, to protect the citizens of the country from armies of the opposition who could come in, and they were showing they could do that. Sherman was not only taking Atlanta, but he was demonstrating to the people of the state of Georgia that the Confederacy could not protect them. That's the message to the civilian population. That's kind of swept under the rug when, histories are written and that people talk about how terrible Sherman was, and what a fire arsonist he was. What really bothered them at the time was that the government was in no way able to protect them and would not surrender. The government of Georgia did not give up, did not surrender or drop out of the Confederacy, despite knowing that they could not protect the people of Georgia from Sherman's armies. I think that's fair to say. And that sort of clock, and of course, the other people in the other states that had not been overtaken yet, they got that message pretty strongly as well. So this was what was happening. This was what the Confederate government was facing as 1863 went into the middle of 1864. So the Confederate government breakdowns and final collapse. July 1863, I consider Vicksburg, Gettysburg the tipping point. The public reaction, desertions mounting. March 1864, Grant takes control of all the armies, becomes the first lieutenant general since George Washington, and puts all of the Union forces in motion at the same time, starting in May, himself taking on the overland campaign toward Richmond. In June 1864, Grant reached the James River outside of Richmond, crossed the James River, and that began the siege of Richmond and Petersburg. Significantly, Lee spoke to several of his generals at that point, or even before that point, and said, once Grant reaches the James River and crosses it, it's just a matter of time, because he knew Richmond would come under siege, and from that point on, they didn't have logistical supplies to be able to, maintain the army or the people on it, for good. They have very limited supplies. So he knew the end at hand in June of 1864. He just didn't acknowledge it by actually having to surrender. But then comes the darkening clouds of Sherman taking Atlanta, and all that did for morale throughout the North. It got Lincoln reelected. It caused many of those troops whose terms of service were expiring in late 1864 to re-enlist, knowing that the end is coming for the Confederacy. So that all happened. Then in November 1864, said Lincoln is reelected. The Sherman's March to the Sea becomes legendary. General Thomas, George Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga, defeated John Hood at the battles of Franklin and Nashville in Tennessee, virtually disintegrating the Army of Tennessee. From that point, there was very little that was keeping the Confederacy able to keep armies even in the field. In January of 1865, Lee wrote on go off to see the Congress, but all they could do was chew tobacco and eat peanuts. Well, no matter what they wanted to do, they couldn't do anything else. They didn't have the wherewithal, they didn't have the infrastructure, they didn't have the supplies. They couldn't access the supplies. Many of the crops that were taken by the impressment people of the Confederacy were sitting in warehouses near railroad stations where the railroads couldn't run anymore because they were intercepted. They were broken. The communication was broken. Bridges came down. Union cavalry raids broke Confederate rail lines. As Sherman moved, he had his famous neckties. Are you familiar with Sherman's bow ties? What they did was when they were breaking up railroads all around Georgia, they basically make a big fire and put the rails, the middle of the rail, each long rail, in the middle of the fire, to the point where when it got hot, they would just bend the rail around trees, etc., so that they could never use, for whatever reason, technology, you can't use the rail if it's been bent like that. So they knew how to do those kinds of things. So when they did their damage, they did permanent damage to the rail and transportation systems. Then, as the links of rail to the ports on the Atlantic coast and the Gulf Coast were closed, even those rail lines became useless for the Confederacy. The Confederacy, for a couple of years, got by replacing these really badly worn tracks by eating up lesser used lines, by using the lesser used tracks from lines that had very little or considerably less strategic value. That's how they kept those the trains in motion to the degree that they actually did. But that was coming apart. They couldn't be doing that, for that much longer. And so then comes February of 1865, a peace conference arranged by Francis Blair, who was friends with Jefferson Davis before the war, who went to Richmond and arranged this peace conference. Now, interestingly, Davis had absolutely no confidence that you could have a peace conference with these other people, with the Union side, because what they saw as a peace conference, those men, Alexander Stephens, R.M.T. Hunter, and John Campbell, I think it was, he was a U.S. judge from Virginia. They went expecting to negotiate a peace with slavery, as if the war didn't happen, as if the Emancipation Proclamation didn't happen. They went and tried to negotiate with Lincoln to be able to maintain slavery in the slave states. And of course, Lincoln, rejected that and sued it. And that pleased Jefferson Davis. As a result of this peace conference, there was a flurry of Confederate patriotism, because actually most people in the Confederacy saw this and heard this and felt, okay, we knew this was going to be, we're going to have to fight to maintain our peculiar institution in the South. That's how, somebody asked a question the other day about slavery and how important was that. It was very important still to most Southerners. And I suppose, I think not just slave owners. It was important because that was the social hierarchy. And if you give blacks, and even some degree of citizenship, not even citizenship, just freedom to live on their own without control, they felt like that was because of their freedom. They defined their freedom by the slavery of black people. That was really the only main difference in the way a lot of them lived. Poor white Southerners who owned either land or slaves, their lives were not that different. They were living basically hand to mouth, looking for a job. They had no independence the way landowning yeoman farmers did. At least they could. Yeoman farmers didn't have much money, but at least they had the independence of growing and living off of what they grew themselves. And hopefully, with a large enough family, you could be able to accumulate more land and begin to, grow enough beyond your own personal needs to enter the market economy at some point. But too many of these people couldn't do that, and too many of the yeoman farmers expected at one point or other to be able to own slaves and continue to grow, eventually become, part of the planter class. That was the goal. It was certainly not going to be to, have own an industrial plant in the South. That was just too little of any of that. So that was still intensely fought over. That the issue of slavery was still very intensely believed in by the Southern side. And neither seriously discussed the surrender that would recognize emancipation. In February 10th, the week after that, Ethelbert Barksdale of Mississippi was built on slaves. They supported that. We supported that. But the Congress debated this issue for about a month, just about a month, before they could agree to pass this law, which they did finally in March. But the final product of the law indicated that this law is allowing black soldiers doesn't change the relationship between the owner of the slave and the slave. In other words, slaves weren't going to be emancipated by this law, and it was, a false flag thing. It gets traction in some quarters where the South was allegedly willing to give up slavery in order to be an independent nation. I think that's too much of a stretch, and that's the position I think that Emory Thomas takes in his book, The Confederate Nation. I don't really believe that. I think that they certainly decided that they were going to maintain some semblance of slavery. Then in March, they Congress authorizes up to 300,000 slaves for the Army, but added, nothing in this act shall be construed to authorize a change in the relation which the said slaves shall bear toward their owners. April 2nd, Confederate troops and the government evacuate Richmond. April 9th, a week later, the surrender of Appomattox. Was that the end? No. April 25th, while he was on the move, I believe that April 25th, he was in Danville, Virginia, where they had set up another capital. They actually set up a capital in Danville, the southern part of Virginia, on the North Carolina border, on the rail line, south. That he was planning to disband. He gave orders to Joseph Johnson, who was still in charge of the army, the remnants of the Army of Tennessee, confronting to the extent that he could Sherman's army, which had moved all the way through South Carolina and into North Carolina, where they were already at Raleigh, which is halfway up north of the state of South North Carolina. To disband his infantry and join Davis with as many cavalry troops and arrange a rendezvous for the men in order that they may continue the fight as partisans. Johnson was then to join Davis with as many troops as he could muster. Johnson refused this direct order and surrendered to Sherman on April 26, 1865, at Jordan Station, North Carolina. It was only by disobeying a direct order from the President of the Confederacy that the Civil War really ended. Davis had other plans, and I mean, he was less concerned. This was where I get the feeling that the portions of the aristocracy in the South were just using these poor civilians as fodder, because who was going to support these poor men, these poor soldiers, without any semblance of logistical support?
So if they were going to recruit all these slaves, and they've been having problems arming the men from the beginning with guns and food, how, okay, you know, they've got 300 people, but you still don't have the guns you need. How does that work?
It doesn't.
Okay.
And
Just throw them out.
this is the point that I think I made the point when we first got into the first class, that the Confederacy wasn't really ready, to start to have a war. It was barely ready to start its own government, much less start its own government and initiate a war. Just to the same point, they were simply unwilling or unready to give up on this in face of the total devastation. And you look at the extent of devastation in the South that happened in the 4 years of the war, you could almost calculate why it took so long for the South to recover after the war. It was complete devastation. The value of the property was a small percentage of it, what it was prior to the war. The devastation of infrastructure, cattle, herds of livestock were decimated during the war.
So was there retribution towards this Confederate government? Where people showed up at your house and hang you or whatever?
No, there wasn't. Grant, at Lincoln's behest, let them down easy. He, I think the most surprised guy in the house in Appomattox was Lee, when he was told by Grant to keep his sideline and go home because I think Lee got all dressed up thinking that he was going to be a prisoner. Grant let him go, let all the soldiers go. Officers could keep their sidearms. Men could keep their horses. That had a lot to do with the willingness of Southerners to accept defeat. They didn't accept the 14th Amendment by any stretch of the imagination. But I think that had a lot to do with their ability to walk away from from the army and not continue to fight the guerrilla warfare that Jefferson Davis seemed intent upon continuing.
Did Johnston know that, he had that knowledge when he decided to,
Disobey?
did he know that Lee had been treated more fairly by?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
That's
As a
part
matter
his
of fact,
decision-making?
as a matter of fact, Sherman treated Johnston even better than Grant gave terms to Lee. In fact, when Sherman telegraphed this copy of this peace pact with Johnston under general guidelines that he had, they rejected it. The Congress rejected it, sent it back, and sent Grant back to North Carolina to replace Sherman and get him out of there because he was too kind. Sherman, at the last minute, just told Johnston, "You're going to have to accept the same terms as Grant gave him," and Sherman and Johnston accepted it. That's why Sherman and Johnston were such good friends after the war. Johnston died about 2 weeks after Sherman. I don't know if you're aware of it. He thought so highly of Sherman that even in his old age, he attended Sherman's funeral I think it was in New York or Ohio, I forgot where, but got pneumonia after it and died once he got back home. Those two men, had a great deal of respect for each other.
Did it happen before they married? It just happened when they.
It happened during and after the war.
Just
And of course,
just when they met the.
Yeah, I don't think that they knew each other before that. I tell you what helped this was, number one, Breckinridge. Because Breckinridge was with Sherman, was with Johnston, and they worked together to negotiate the first deal and then accept the second deal. So Johnston didn't quite do it alone. But one thing was very important. Johnston and Jefferson Davis despised each other. And they had been arguing from the first time that Johnston received his first commission as a Confederate officer. He was assigned as generalship as junior to Lee, and he was ranked higher in the U.S. Army than Lee, and didn't like it a bit, and complained to Jefferson Davis, and Jefferson Davis was basically distant and insulted him, and they could never see eye to eye. And that's part of what was going on with the Confederate hierarchy. Remember, we talked about how these aristocratic type people, they didn't want to be questioned. And when they were questioned, they just took it as personal insults. And that had a lot to do with all of these petty jealousies and these confrontational insults that Confederate politicians, especially, these are mostly all wealthy people who were the leaders of the Confederacy. They didn't really have the knowledge of what it was like to be a poor person living in the Confederacy. They didn't really care too much about that. They acted in their own interests. The planter class acted in their own interests prior to the war. They had everything their own way. And they did so during the war and after the war, when they got right back into power. And they did, to get back into power, they basically used the same thing. What are we going to do? How are we going to deal with these free blacks now? KKK, Jim Crow, that's how it all started. And it grew, and it's remained until the federal government stepped in the mid-20th century. I mean, it's really that simple, and I think it is. There are obviously, complications, but I think that had a lot to do with, why, for example, the lost cause mythology took hold. That's the way they wanted to see it. It was too important to the Southerners to not have, a high regard for their for their way of life, their southern antebellum civilization. I grew up in New York with this image, these images from numerous sources, subliminal, pretty much, of how marvelous it was to have lived in the antebellum South. I think it's fair to say most of us, have those. I got it as, as a 6-year-old kid going to the Kingsway Theater in Brooklyn on Coney Island Avenue, seeing Song of the South, and how happy everybody was in that. And the slaves were happy, and the rabbits were happy, and everybody was happy. And those were the images, and that was Walt Disney doing that. And, who didn't trust Walt Disney? That was the gist of it. In my high school history, American history book, there's all kinds of lost cause mythology passed along. And that's why I had those images as a kid in school, high school, 17 years old, 16 years old, taking American history, learning, the greatness of Nathan Bedford Forrest.
The story of Reconstruction was about how horrible it was for the Southerners.
That's right.
But they were never taught anything about the 14th Amendment and freedom for black people, and
Black people
never heard any of that. It was all about how horrible it was.
And you combine that with Jubal Early and his writings as the wartime, not wartime, the Southern Historical Society papers, 25 volumes, 25 books, all about the Confederate point of view of the entire war. And many of these were articles written by Confederate leaders during, after the war. And it always just demonstrated the unity of the Southern soldier. You never had the slightest sense that they had desertion issues or that they had people resisting.
Chivalry was supreme.
Well, right. We're all behind the Bonnie Blue flag. And it just creates, and unfortunately, there are a lot of people today. I mean, how many times do you hear people start talking about, we need to secede again? Texas wants to secede.
Can we get them back to Mexico?
Well, but the point is that it's all based on this false view of what really happened in the Civil War. I post sometimes on some of these Sons of Confederate veteran bulletin boards. What about the 300,000 white Southerners who fought for the Union? What about their families? What about East Tennessee? All of East Tennessee was completely Union. How do they stand in this project? What about the 22 families? My friend Paul Callahan wrote that book recently about where freedom fell, freedom lost in Talbot County and the Eastern Shore during the Civil War because Lincoln administration kept people from voting, kept secessionists from voting, and he said, democracy died, out here during the war. Well, from my standpoint, democracy died right after the war, when those Confederate soldiers came back and took their jobs, and the black Union soldiers came back and were treated like they were still slaves, largely. Couldn't own businesses, couldn't own property, couldn't get an education. That's where freedom was lost, but the lost cause mythology, leads you to believe that the perpetrators, that the Confederates were the victims, rather than the people who were trying to undermine the U.S. Constitution. That's another story for another day. But the point is that this is where it began, and this is why it began. And so I also found some stuff about, Jefferson Davis being finally captured in Irwinville, Georgia on May 10th, 1865. Well, others, other members of his cabinet and other generals also were making themselves scarce, once the Appomattox happened. Judah Benjamin I mean, the story I took right out, I'm not totally verbatim, but out of William Davis's book, about how the trip that he took, he was on the same path of Jefferson Davis down through the Carolinas, went as far as the railroad would take them, and then by horseback through Georgia. And he was about 4 days ahead of Davis's party. And they kept moving along at a quicker, because they were a smaller group than Davis, not drawing as much attention. So, and they were in disguise. I mean, it was, they were looking to escape to England. And Judah Benjamin finally gets down to the Tampa area, gets on a boat, goes to Nassau, Bimini, and gets on a sloop bound for Nassau to go across to get across the ocean. But this sloop that was bound for Nassau had a cargo of dry sponges, and the cargo hold got wet, and the sponges all expanded, and the ship sank. And here was this cabinet member of the Confederacy in a little boat with 3 black guys and 1 oar, 30 miles off the coast of Florida. And think of the depths that this guy must have dealt with, because and it's amazing, as he went back, finally they made their way back. They were picked up by some brig, taken back to Bimini, and then a 6-day trip to Nassau. Finally got the boat to Havana. And then in Havana, he meets Edmund Kirby Smith, also running from, to try to get to Europe from Texas. And then got an ocean-going ship to England on August 6th, but that caught fire. They had to return for repairs. And finally, he got to Southampton, England on August 20th, which ironically was about the same time that Confederate leaders, Alexander Stephens, Trenholm, and Reagan, were being released from prison. They stayed home. They allowed themselves to be captured, not really fearing too much in the way of retribution, and rightly so. And they stayed home, and they spent a couple of months in prison, and then they were released. About the same time, poor Judah Benjamin finally made it to England. And eventually they, came back. Jubal Early did the same thing. Found his way back, and they had money. They could afford to pay their fare to get across. They did. And then when the Union retribution didn't come, they felt free to come back. And when they did come back, what did they do? They were all about how awful the Union was and how great the Confederacy. They had no shame or no conscience about what happened, to the extent that Early created this big, lost cause thing, and became the great defender of R.E. Lee's reputation at the cost of lying all about James Longstreet, making Longstreet the goat of the Confederacy, the villain, the Judas Iscariot of the Confederacy, because he had dared criticize Robert E. Lee after the Battle of Gettysburg. And meanwhile, if you really look at where the problems were at Gettysburg, it was Early himself and a couple of his other conspirators of lost cause mythology who screwed things up at Gettysburg royally on day 2 and day 3. So the Confederacy had come apart, and a lot of them felt like they couldn't stay in the country. They were angry. They were fearful. One of the things that Early had a right to feel fearful about was the fact that he ordered the town of Pennsylvania. Forgot the name of the town, but he ordered it to be burned by General McCausland during this, in 1864, when he came up to attack Washington. He ordered this town in Pennsylvania, which was the town that Thaddeus Stevens owned his factory in. He ordered the town to give him X amount of food and supplies. They couldn't do it, so he ordered it burned. To that extent, I think it's fair that Early did leave the country, but he did come back. Emory Thomas, in his Confederation, said most Southerners, of course, do not follow in the example of Davis or Edmund Ruffin. Edmund Ruffin, you may recall, was the secessionist from Virginia who was present at Fort Sumter, fired the light lanterns, the first few lanterns that fired the cannons on Fort Sumter. He, along with Roger Pryor, was Virginia's two primary secessionists. Well, after the war, Ruffin refused to live in the Union with the Yankees again, so he committed suicide. He shot himself and wrote about it beforehand, and that I could never live in a Yankee nation. Rather, most Southerners turned to the model of Lee for inspiration and set out to rebuild their land and lives. But Reconstruction in the post-war South could not be the resurrection of the antebellum South. And ex-Confederates who accepted defeat in the Union, were often unable to accept the consequences of being a vanquished people. Thus, as the lost cause lingered in the Southern soul, thus has the Confederacy, real and imagined, as an experience and myth, since defined Southern identity and made of Southerners a peculiar people. Now, that's the head of the University of Georgia's history department writing, who is a great historian, but he still maintains that uniqueness that the Southerners are a people. I don't really agree with that. I think Americans are a people. Southerners were Southerners living in America. They were Americans, not a Southern people. In my view, that's my way of looking at it. He was in his prime at the University of Georgia in, the 50s and 60s into the 70s. So you kind of would expect something like that. But he had a lot of candor. His book on his biography of Robert E. Lee is, I think, the best biography of Lee. It's really pretty candid. But I think his perspective is how Southerners see themselves probably today. And of course, many of us are Southerners too. I mean, if you were born in Maryland or anywhere south, you're a Southerner. This was a slave state, and even though it didn't join the Confederacy, it acted like a Confederate state after the war, with Jim Crow and the same types of laws that the former Confederates used after the war. That's simply, it's a view of a Northerner. But as I tell people, I'm from South Carolina, so I always felt like I Southern. We were different than those northern people who lived so close to Manhattan. We were far down by Coney Island, we were far away. But in summer, it was probably ill-advised to start the war, but South Carolina was the radical impact, and they were in control. In January of January 20th, 1861, Jefferson Davis wrote to Governor Pickens, South Carolina, regarding Fort Sumter. And he said, that little garrison presses on nothing but a point of pride. It wasn't really strategically important. But the little garrison of 70 men in Fort Sumter weren't a threat to commerce. They were they were more under siege than being a problem, it was just a point of problem. But by April 4th, 1861, uh, 8 days before the firing on Fort Sumter that Jefferson Davis took charge of on behalf of the Confederate national government, he was very much aware that on April 4th, the state of Virginia's secession convention voted 89 to 45 against secession. 8 days before the firing of Fort Sumter, 89 to 45 against secession. North Carolina, other middle South states wouldn't even call secession conventions. And they knew, as I alluded early on, that without those middle South and border South states, the two most populous states in the Confederacy were North Carolina and Virginia. Missouri had the second largest city, St. Louis, the third largest city in the South, St. Louis, and all the armament, all the industry there. Baltimore was the fourth largest city in America with all kinds of industry. They knew they needed these states to survive. They took the chance. They weren't prepared. They knew they weren't prepared. They knew they didn't have a strong economy. They was a banana republic with cotton, sugar, tobacco. But they felt like they needed to do it anyway. As time went on, they were pretty sure that Lincoln was not going to make that plunge and do anything erratic to cause the Unionists in the Middle South to agree that the interests of slavery would be safer under a Confederate nation than under the U.S. Constitution. That's what kept the rest of those slave states in the Union, including, amazingly enough, Kentucky and Missouri. And Maryland. It becomes clear that it was a desperate act, and it wasn't. It was controlled by radicals. South Carolina was really, I believe, in more control of that situation than the Confederate government, and they pushed all the buttons, and they got it. They were hurt for it. Oddly enough, Confederate Secretary of State, first Confederate Secretary of State, Robert Toombs, I wrote here, warned Davis against an attack on Sumter. He maintained that at this time it is suicide, murder, and will lose us every friend at the North. He will randomly strike a hornet's nest, which extends from the mountains to the ocean, and legions now quiet will swarm out and sting us to death. It puts us in the wrong. It is fatal. And that's from one of the strongest secessionists that the South had. The president, the cabinet, Congress had few good options because of finance. There were no good alternatives. The new government needed more time to establish itself fiscally. It did not give itself that time. Yes.
Well, wasn't the South counting on the fact that just as France had come in the Revolutionary War, that England would come in because of
Because of cotton.
their textile.
Yes, that's what they thought. And they had reason to think that because the Union did not have a substantial navy. In 1861, they had 60 ships, but most of those ships, there were only about 12 armed sailboats, large ships, all under sail, that could try to blockade the entire Atlantic and Gulf coasts. So there was reason to believe that the South could export enough cotton to be reimbursed with arms and ammunition and everything else that they needed to maintain themselves in the field, in a military situation. But they didn't have their own ships. They all, even during the pre-war era, it was the Northerners who owned most of all the ships that were soldiers that were on the ships. Amazingly enough, there were very few ports, large ports in the South that constructed ships. Baltimore was one. New Orleans was one. St. Louis was one. But there were no other places in the Confederacy that really made ships. And they didn't, they didn't make use of all the timber, all the wood, if there were factories in the South that made furniture, made all kinds of, wooden, things that the North made, with wood, they wouldn't have had to buy things from the North. They would have had it, and they would have been making money, and they would have had a more diversified economy prior to the war. But they didn't do that. So they found themselves without ships to get to England. They settled on these blockade runners that basically could get out of port and get over to Havana or Nassau or some other place where a British ship could take the cotton and bring it over. They couldn't do it themselves. They listened to Senator South Carolina senator who gave the great King Cotton speech in 1859 about that cotton is the king, and Europe and the rest of the world has to bow to the South because we have the cotton, and that makes the world go round. And to an extent, it really did. On the other hand, you couldn't get the cotton where it needed to be. It didn't do it any good, and it didn't do the Confederacy because they couldn't do much with that. And that's what the miracle of Gideon Wells and the Navy produced. Gideon Wells and the Navy produced these ironclad ships within months after the firing of Fort Sumter. The naval architect Poop from Boston came to Washington. Happened to meet with James Eads, the Mississippi River captain who understood, saw what, and was an industrial man himself, and understood quickly that with Poop's concept, he could make armed vessels that could move up and down the large southern rivers. And within 4 or 5 months, he had 7 such gunboats that Grant immediately put to use to take Fort Donelson and Fort Henry. And that quickly opened up Nashville to being taken over in February of 1862. It led to the Battle of Shiloh, where Grant, under pressure, was reinforced by river and had plenty enough troops the next day to go immediately on the defensive after a terrible defeat the previous day. This was how industry in the North took over. And then quickly, at the same time that the Battle of Fort Donelson was going on in February of 1862, that's when the USS Monitor was commissioned. By March of 1862, the Monitor was already in Hampton Roads, Virginia, and neutralized the Confederate ironclad CSS Virginia, which they had eventually to scuttle when they had to give up Norfolk Harbor during the Peninsula Campaign early in the spring of 1862. This is how the industry overwhelmed the Confederacy. And somehow, because the North had enough people who were able to be taxed financially, they not only taxed people and financially, they made great profits and went far over the top. Like I think I mentioned last week before how northern farmers created enough surplus grain and food crop to help stave off, greatly to stave off the famine in Russia during the war. Well, this was all going on, despite the fact that so many of the husbands and their families were off in the armies. They had enough mechanization on the farm to where women and youngsters could run the implements. It was not a hand crops that you needed to use your hands with. You could use machinery. And it was that industry that powered the Union to where at the end of the war, the United States had the strongest navy in the world. And the earliest full ironclad war vessels that made any hope of England breaking up this country a dream. It just ended any further discussion by people who would attack the United States of America. Which is why I guess Lincoln understood the only way to take America down is from the inside. And he knew that, early on. So the government of the Confederacy decided, had a decided inability to deal with the extreme effects of the war on its civilian population. And by 1864, I think we talked about how there were hundreds of thousands of civilians, how the city of Richmond went from 40,000 in 1861 to 100,000 by the middle of 1862 or early 1863. There was no further infrastructure to support those people. And how the people of the South were just ravaged by poverty to where we had the amazing, unthinkable events in several different cities of women's bread riots in the streets. That, in Southern society, just to think of something like that, just to envision it would almost be impossible for Southern women to think that they could do such a thing. But they were that desperate. They were hungry. They had extended family living with them in terrible conditions in cities like Richmond and Atlanta, Charlotte, I think, and in numerous places. This was unheard of. But the conditions that they were put into because of the inability to have the logistical capability of supporting a population made it so. And there was very little they could do once the war was going on the way. It was too late to think it over. They had to be ready for it. And I say this arguably, the fact that the Confederacy survived for 4 years reflects more of a reflection on the unprepared nature of both sides, especially the Union side, to overcoming the challenges of subduing 250,000 square miles of territory. The Anaconda Plan of Winfield Scott was great on paper, but it was just a paper plan. There was no infrastructure to actually be able, in early 1861, for the Union to ever implement the Anaconda Plan. But lo and behold, by middle of 1862, it was already implementing that Anaconda Plan because they had a river navy that was dominating, could go anywhere they logistically bring troops to support them. They couldn't take Vicksburg until 1863, but once that happened, they owned the Mississippi River and started moving grain and wheat, et cetera, from the northern farms right down the Mississippi River out of New Orleans and to Europe. And so, and plus the size of the Navy had grown, the ocean-going Navy had grown big time. So again, it was the industry of the North that really made a big difference. But somehow the collective memory that we have as Americans, makes the Southern cause, very heroic and worth calling, giving great credit, attention, and admiration. And that's just the way it is. The books that I generally use were these that I give you. Our library here in town has a number of these books. But I think they're all very, I wouldn't necessarily say any one. One, you have one book to read, it's always Confederate Nation of the person. If you really want to understand more about the personalities, you want to be into that sort of thing. Certainly, William Davis's three books are outstanding. George Grable wrote the Confederate Republic. He also has a slightly different take than Davis. And I like that. His approach is pretty realistic. He gets the point on. And conscription and conflict in the Confederacy by Albert Burke Mark, I talked about that already. That is an awesome book. It goes into the details of how the extent to which Southerners evaded conscription and deserted and did everything they could not to be caught up in the war based on their dedication or lack thereof to the institution of slavery. And it was very much a geographical consideration where there were a few slaves to threaten and to be needed. There was proportionally less dedication by civilians, non-slave owners, to the Confederate war. Questions? Comments?
Yeah, well, you mentioned last time I had to run that call. The Richmond newspaper, I think,
The Examiner?
was the Examiner said something about, it mentioned it's as bad as Confederate Jews.
Right.
And like, when you're talking, I looked at, the Confederate view of Jews during the war, it looked like it was kind of similar, that you had people that were for slavery and weren't, but that's a paper in Richmond saying.
Well, I think it's, first of all, as a New Yorker, I grew up, I've been to many more bar mitzvahs than I ever was to, first communions. And I know the extent to which those people are often accused unfairly of greediness or whatever it is. They stay to themselves, they intermarry themselves, at least in my experience with people in New York. But they have been targeted, and Grant was one that targeted them from the Union side and was reprimanded strongly by Lincoln in 1864 for keeping newspapermen and people who were selling things to the army. That it was basically the Jews that were profiting from this, giving information to the enemy. In Richmond, they were extortioners. And the easiest way to excuse extortion among your privileged, wealthy Southerners is to just blame the Jews, which is what I think is what they did. That would be that's my take on it. And whether it was the Examiner or the other paper, any of the other newspapers, I think that was almost SOP, the way they took their own faults and blame it on somebody else. Because otherwise, I'm sure, I don't know the number of Jews that there were in the Confederacy, but I know that very few people had enough money in the Confederacy to be able to corner a market on anything, to be able to create extortionist prices for a product or small products, which is really what they did to extort. For example, if you could get your hands on considerable amounts of salt or some necessity of life, and you could have enough money to buy enough, you could corner a market and charge anything you wanted, and they did. And they were allegedly Southerners, and they created a lot of resentment, even among their fellow wealthy Southerners. But I think that when it comes to finding a scapegoat, they found it. And I think it was just that. I don't think that there was any accuracy. I think it was just a generalized accusation. Yes.
A couple of questions. Is this Henry Foote of Tennessee any relation to Shelby Foote?
Probably. I think, I don't know offhand, but probably he was, there was another Foote who was Mississippian, who was, that might be, there were two Footes. There was Henry Foote, and there was a politician from Mississippi who was a huge opponent of Jefferson Davis prior to the war, and won a seat, won Jefferson Davis's congressional seat, or senatorial seat in the early 1850s, when Davis went too far in calling for secession then. And so I'm not sure which foot it is.
But Shelby was from Atlanta, right?
No, he was from Memphis.
He was Memphis. So-
Yeah.
So maybe.
Could be. I wouldn't doubt it.
And my second question is one of the reasons I took this course, this class, it's one of the most immediate questions that comes to mind when you think of the Civil War is, why did the South lose? And before I heard your recent talks, I might have said they were doomed to begin with and at an immediate disadvantage. And why I questioned how much time they had to organize between when they declared their secession.
Well, actually, the war started with fire on Fort Sumter.
Right, but it was like 4 months that they had to organize and to get themselves together and everything, and that there was, I didn't understand that there was so much dissension within the Confederate States to begin with. Whereas you had more of a unified army and governance in the North.
Well, one thing is clear, that the best, most succinct comment was made by Robert Jones. All right, you read it? You know, we're gonna be waking up, it's not like Admiral Yamamoto. We're gonna be waking up a sleeping giant. And that's what happened. I mean, before Fort Sumter, Lincoln wouldn't have been able to get 500 people to cross the street to go attack the South. Nobody wanted to do that. Fire on the flag, in those days, it was different, I suppose, than it is now. But if you fire on the flag and shoot at America, I mean, that's going to irk an awful lot of people. And it just turned the North into a hugely vengeful group to where you could get these people from Massachusetts. Within 4 days of Fort Sumter, a week after Fort Sumter, these people were already on a train going to Baltimore to try to get to defend Washington, because they knew it was pretty much defenseless. That's the extent to which these people were incensed by firing on Fort Sumter. And so many Democrats, Northern Democrats, otherwise potential copperhead types against the war for any reason, they were all pushed over the edge to support, the Lincoln administration. They joined the army. That's one of the reasons why the western states, Iowa, Michigan, Wisconsin, Indiana, they all contributed vastly to the Union Army, in both theaters. They were part and parcel of the people who certainly had strong racist beliefs before the war, and who came around largely to where they would continue to make sacrifice their lives, to save the Union and to allow blacks some measure of independence and to support the abolition of slavery. And it turned many of these people's minds away from what they had thought prior to the war.
Just for balance, you just talk about how disorganized the South was.
Yes.
The North was not organized. They had draft rights in New York City. Wall Street was totally for the South. That Wall Street was financing all those plantations. They were not in favor of the war. Then you had the Irish immigrants in the North. They hated, they were very, very much racist. And they were not, so there's a lot of dissension in the North. That's a different topic, a different topic.
Well,
Both sides were having trouble.
And interestingly, and I, as a Brooklynite, sense the difference between the borough of Brooklyn on one side of the East River and the borough of Manhattan, the city of New York, on the other side of the East River. And knowing full well, I had some detailed information about, what was really going on in New York. Why did those poor immigrant Irish, why were they so intensely anti being drafted? This was the conscription rights. They were rioting because of conscription. Well, one of the reasons why they were rioting is because they were poor. And because of the war, New York had gotten hundreds of thousands of dollars in government grants. And for the first time, these people had great jobs and they were making money. And now they were being drafted to have to leave their jobs and to go fight a war that they felt was now for emancipation and not for just keeping the Union, which was the original, commentary by the Lincoln administration. That's really, the big thing. I mean, yes, Fernando Wood, the mayor of New York, and Seymour, governor of New York, which one of the other, they were staunch Democrats. On the other hand, they also, the state was making huge amounts of money with grants. And, for example, Brooklyn, which was right across the river, was as patriotic a county, Kings County. Kings County provided more men per capita to the Union Army than any other county in the entire North, right across the river. I mean, how different could it have been? New York City contributed thousands upon thousands of men, to the Union Army. I'm not sure how many stayed in or anything like that. I'm sure that they had their dissension. But one of the reasons why the city was why the rioters were able to get away with all that was because the Union troops that were stationed in New York were out of town at Gettysburg right after the Battle of Gettysburg, and the rioters understood that there was no protection, no army protection, for doing whatever they wanted to disrupt society, and they did it. But as soon as the army returned, they went peacefully, and many of them did wind up getting drafted properly according to law. But I think that was the big reason why those Union draft rights. Interestingly, statistically, in 1861, there were about 15,000 African Americans living in Manhattan, the island of Manhattan, New York City, out of a population of 3/4 of a million. In Baltimore, out of a population of 250 million, there were 25,000 free blacks, nearly 30,000 free blacks, also working and competing for jobs, for government contract jobs, in the Port of Baltimore. You would think that in a slave state where there were 25, nearly 30,000 free blacks living in the city competing for jobs with white men, that would be like a torch ready to go off. Nothing like that happened at all. That's because the politicians who were in charge at the time, because it was Union occupied, kept control of things. In New York, with the two Democratic leaders, Democratic mayor and the Democratic governor, they fanned the flames of this resentment. And with half the number of blacks and 3 times the number of whites, they were basically used. I often use that expression. They were used like the poor folks in the South were used, just as tools for the politicians and the wealthy people. So that's just my opinion, but I'm sure that, and also as a Catholic high school, private Catholic schools, I think that the Catholic Church had a lot of, most of these poor Irish immigrants were Catholics, and I think the Catholic Church didn't do much good. I think that they didn't do anything to calm the attitudes once the draft was called into effect. So it certainly is an ugly reflection on the Union cause. And not a good reflection on New York, but I think that's close to it. You know, you had copperheads in Ohio. There was incredible dissension in the North. But as time went on, blacks started taking casualties as U.S. colored troops. I think that the attitudes of an awful lot of Midwesterners and Northerners, Northeasterners alike, changed toward blacks. They saw that they were in it themselves, and they should get some reward for the sacrifices that they made during the war.
After 1862, did the Virginia delegations of the Confederate Congress still include representatives from the western, what became West Virginia?
No,
Okay.
West Virginia was never a part of the Virginia government once they refused to participate in secession. They rejected secession, 33 counties. They started meeting on their own in Wheeling.
And the Virginia accepted it?
No, but now, just because 33 counties refused, doesn't mean that every single person in those 33 counties felt that way. I'm sure there were some people from Western Virginia who supported the Confederacy.
Stonewall Jackson, actually.
Right. So that's true, but largely, as an entity, those 33 counties started meeting unofficially and started applying right away for statehood. And by middle of 1863, they became the state of West Virginia, never to go back. Not that if you go to West Virginia, you'll hear the same sort of, reminiscences about the Confederacy that you get here.
East Tennessee, a trip to East Tennessee, they thought they had it too. They were following West Virginia. They thought they were right in there to be the next state. East Tennessee.
Right.
But they were
Never
never
did.
close, right?
And that's another black eye, because, those people in East Tennessee suffered mightily at the hands of the Confederate authorities, the state authorities of Tennessee. And they did some tremendous damage to the Confederacy by destroying railroad bridges. And East Tennessee was a really strategic place, the Gap, Cumberland Gap was right at, in part of it was in East Tennessee. Chattanooga was East Tennessee, Knoxville. That was enemy territory for the Confederacy. And they didn't get the cooperation of people. They were spies. And 40,000 people from Tennessee fought for the Union. And they suffered. Families suffered. They moved out. I don't know, not much detail, but it was odd. I mean, that was not so odd because they were clearly non-involved in slavery. It was the mountain country, just like the portion of Kentucky, the hilly part of Kentucky, the hilly portions of North Carolina, the hilly portions of northwest Georgia and northeastern Alabama. They were never strong. They all voted against secession, even in those middle states, even after Fort Sumter. But they were dragged in. Just as some West Virginians were dragged into the Union, a lot of people in the South, the South couldn't afford it. They didn't have the numbers to be able to afford to lose those kind of numbers. In a long fight with the North. Nobody in 1861 thought that the war was going to last more than 3 or 6 months. Who knew? We knew. They didn't. So that's pretty much what happened. So the Confederate government had a virtually impossible job. They couldn't do it. That's what it was. And there was a lot of dissension and a lot of big egos, because the Confederate government was largely carried by the aristocratic class of the South. And they didn't take well to criticism from anybody, much less including each other. And that really went a long way to create and build constantly on the dissension. The attitudes of Joe Johnston Pierre Beauregard to Jefferson Davis. You wouldn't want to leave them in a room alone because there would be gunplay if that was the case. And the same with some of these personalities. Robert Monroe Reddick, and the heaviest secessionists in South Carolina. They were inconsolable. They would not stand for that state remaining in the Union. There were enough of them, and they were largely in control of that state legislature. Whoever controlled those state legislatures were largely in control of whether there was going to be a civil war or not. And I've said this numerous times. I feel that the planter class in the South was pretty much the only group that could have actually saved a civil war, from occurring in this country, because they could have eased the slavery laws that would have made slavery much more, not that it was completely uncivilized the way it was, but it would have humanized them and the slaves much more by recognizing, for example, slave marriages, allowing blacks to testify in court against white people. Just those two things alone.
Allowing families to state it better. Allowing families to state it.
Right, not selling off,
Yeah.
not selling off individual members as a punishment for one family member not being obeying probably. Those things would have made a big difference, I think. I don't know that, I just feel that way. Other than they just closed the door, even during the war, Southern religious leaders saw this as a problem. They said, if we just did that, it would help our cause. We would get political support, and would diminish the Northerners, an abolitionist desire to destroy slavery. Didn't even get a second thought from the people in power. And like I said, within 10 years after the end of the Civil War, 70% of the people who were in political power in the South before the war were back in power after. And they largely led that resistance that has continued throughout the 19th century and well into the 20th century. That's just, the old historian Phillips, Ulrich Phillips, said that, slavery was the main engine of the South, was the main thought of the South in the antebellum times. And I have to agree, it probably was. They just couldn't lower their demands. They had it from the time of the Revolutionary Days. It was in the Constitution. It was being protected by the U.S. Constitution, and largely was. The fugitive slave law from the Compromise of 1850. The fugitive slave law ensured that slaves would be returned. Now,